Scott, thank you so much for joining us today on episode 5 of the ManageSpace podcast. Just to introduce myself, I'm James McLean. I'm a marketing analyst at Radius Plus. And one of the things that I really like about my job is I get to talk to a lot of people at trade shows about what they do and how they've been involved in the industry, and just to learn from a lot of industry veterans like yourself about the self-storage industry. Obviously, you're someone who needs no introduction, but for those of you who maybe are new to the self-storage industry, Scott, can you just tell us a little bit about who you are?
Sure. And thanks, James. Glad to be here and spend some time on this side of the podcast. We've had several folks on Radius Plus on ours as well. And looking forward to chatting about self-storage. In terms of my background, started in self-storage back in 2005. So we're going on 17, coming up on 18 years in the business. Seen a lot of changes. This will be our third recession that we're heading into. And although we think we may know what to expect, every recession is a little bit different. But as many people know, self-storage does very well during a recession. It is very recession resistant. It is inflation resistant. And we've been preparing since the last recession back in 2008 for the next one. We thought it was going to occur a few years ago, but we've been bolstering up our lending relationships as well as our private equity partners, and also gathering some cash and building up our back office and teams as we now look to the next several years for being probably some of the best, at least for our company, in terms of acquisitions and also continuing to development. Because we know that when the economy slows, banks slow down, other investors exit the industry. And it's just time for those of us that have been around for a while, the veterans, to go out and continue to do business, but at just a little quicker pace than we have in the past. So looking forward to the next several years and what self-storage is going to hold for us as we continue to move forward.
Now, Scott, you have sort of a unique experience and resume in the fact that you started kind of right before the big recession in 2008. How do you think having that exposure to those immediate hard times and only having 3 years under your belt in the self-storage industry has affected your strategy and kind of your outlook on the economic situation now, as someone who's just dipping their toes in the water currently?
Sure. Well, I've been investing in real estate for over 25 years. And so I went through the recession of 99 and in 2000. I had single family houses and apartments back then. And that was, again, a different recession, not only for real estate, but then also for self-storage. And I wish I'd been in self-storage at that time. I think every self-storage investor, when they say, hey, what is the biggest mistake you ever made? And that was not getting in soon enough. But we learned from that recession from a real estate standpoint what it is that we needed to do. And as I begin to look at self-storage, getting out of the tenant and toilet business, one of the things that drew me to self-storage was the fact that it was recession resistant. And then heading into it, yes, in 2005, times were good. Lending was abundant, and lenders, even though I was educating many of them, the lenders that I've been working with, they still had understood the dynamics of self-storage, and that it has the lowest loan default rate. It has the lowest loan loss rate in the meantime, which is it's easier for us to be able to then go out and get to loans from these small community banks. And so that's what we were doing, is building up that portfolio and building up those lending relationships. So having gone through in 2008, what I learned, and then what I wish I had was, first of all, I wish I would have had more equity partners and stronger lending relationships. And yes, that I'd have gotten into self-storage a little bit earlier, because what we saw on the back end of that then is the folks that owned a lot of self-storage facilities benefited from the fact that businesses downsize and individuals downsize during a recession. And so if you're in the business, you get the benefit of that. And we are in the trauma and transition business, and self-storage does very well for those reasons. And so demand is up, rates were up. The folks that were in the business at the time that did have access to private equity and strong lending relationships, they were still developing. And so most of those folks, those are the REITs and the national players and other folks that had deep pockets. So what we did is we got really good at raising private equity at that time. And we had only been doing it for maybe a year or two coming out of the recession. And so slow is the pace in which we had to go, because we didn't have those relationships, and there were a whole lot of folks scared. That was a very deep, long recession. There wasn't a whole lot of folks that had deep pockets and money to invest in other asset classes or passively, and everybody was still a little bit skittish to find out just exactly what was going to happen. And so those are the things and the steps that we began to take. But really, more than anything, was just then begin to prepare, because we know, pretty much clockwork, We have a recession every 7 to 10 years, and we knew that there was another one. And so what was at the forefront of our mind is we're going to do as much as we can during this recession to get into the business and to grow our portfolio. But more than anything, we are going to prepare ourselves for the next one because we were taking notes and we understood exactly what was happening, and so that we were more prepared for this one. So I'm not sure if that answers your questions, James, but that's how we've approached it, and that's how we're heading into this one.
No, absolutely. Thank you for those insights. And I think to your point, like just being prepared and having gone through it, you're not
Mhm.
as like worried or scared about it because you have kind of worked through that time period.
Mhm.
Now, just to help me understand, do you as self-storage investing do acquisitions as well as development, or do you
Mhm.
mostly help people acquire and add value to existing facilities?
Yeah, the business began by buying a value add self-storage facilities. So we would go out and find the mom and pop facilities in the secondary and tertiary markets. Lack of technology, sometimes no websites, especially in the beginning when we started back in '05. Folks that just ran out of steam, ran out of time. Maybe they ran out of their depreciation. They owned the facilities for a number of years and they wanted to sell to be able to get a new asset that they could depreciate. They were trading in, trading up for all those reasons. We were buying the value add facilities that still had some meat on the bone. We could raise rates, add technology, and reduce expenses, and most importantly, payroll. And then anytime that we could find a facility where we could expand, in other words, it was a 5-acre parcel that had buildings on 3 acres or 4 acres, and we still had some room to be able to expand and put additional buildings and therefore square footage and units on those sites. That was the grand slam home run. If we could implement all of our best business practices to raise revenues and decrease expenses, and then have the expansion component on top of that, then that was the recipe that we continued to replicate over and over and over again. And then we begin to, as we got really good at expanding and developing on those existing sites, that's when we begin to look at and seek out other development opportunities by way of joint ventures, and then also going out and acquiring the land on our own and building from the ground up, and then conversions, which are really our favorite. I mean, that is slow to mark or slow to um, gain competition from other folks because you're in an infill location, but very quick to turn around. If you were to purchase a building that already had zoning in place, the shell's there. We can put up walls and doors in a matter of months and open the doors and build more value that way from an asset that is repurposed that everybody else looked at, like the apartment folks and condo folks, and decided they couldn't make it work. But if we can pick it up then on the cheap and then convert it and change the use to storage, that those are opportunities that we absolutely love and search for all the time, when we can in any time that we can get a conversion opportunity versus a ground up development.
I haven't had too many conversations around conversions. Well, can you kind of give me like a high level insight, like what you look for? What's like your ideal site
Hmm.
for a conversion? Like what metrics you look for?
Yeah.
Me to
So
see like
there's a number of ways we go about the business, James, and that is, we have an education business as well. So we've been teaching people for 15 years about the business and consulting. And I speak for the trade shows, and I'm on a lot of podcasts. We've done a lot of consulting and writing articles. And I say all that to point to the fact that we have a lot of exposure. Myself and our business gets a lot of exposure from all the people that we've taught and consulted with and done joint ventures with about the business. And so many of those opportunities come to us without us having to go out and specifically market. But that being said, and we'll go anywhere where there's an opportunity into a market, as long as the market is strong, the rental rates are strong, which drives the market. And if we can get a conversion opportunity, an old grocery store, an old warehouse to repurpose, a manufacturing building, whatever it looks like, we first begin with the market. And looking at in a 3 to 5 mile radius, what is the supply index, and is it oversupplied or undersupplied? And then we look to the rates. Are the rates strong? And that is all balanced with the overall development costs. And so we start with the end in mind. Here's what's going to cost to buy this building. Here's how we model this out in terms of square footage. Here's the rental rate per square foot. And here's what a typical at an expense ratio, which we feel comfortable with. Here's what the NOI will be when it's stabilized. And then we reverse engineer everything backwards from there, with regards to then the cost of the building and the overall cost of the project, to see if it pencils out. And then as we get stabilized and carry our projections forward, say 3 to 4 years, once we get to that place, what does that look like to be able to sell? Can we profit in a way that makes money not only for our equity partners as we syndicate and put these projects together in our fund, but then at the end of the day, after we pay everybody off, have we made enough money, and was it worth our time to be able to do so? So lots of considerations and lots of steps. but those are the main ones. We find a project first, and then we look back into the markets and everything else and reverse engineer from there, versus going out and saying, hey, we're going to go and expand in this particular market in Oklahoma, and then begin to search for sites. We do things a little bit differently, only because of I have the benefit, quite honestly, and fortunate that we have so many opportunities that do land on our plate from all the folks that have known about us and have worked with us over the years.
Yeah, I think people really do kind of look for you and your organization for some type of guidance and direction. Especially a lot of like people come onto Radius and they say, "Hey, Scott Myers mentioned your platform, and I'm like learning from him." So I
Hmm.
definitely think you've helped a lot of people navigate the self-storage investing realm.
Hmm.
One question I had is you mentioned like in the upcoming recession, things are slowing down because it is harder to get money. Where
Hmm.
do you see most of the slowdown happening in acquisitions, conversions, and add value projects, or in development? Because in my mind, it would be development would be harder to do now to get like loans and investors. But do you think that both sides of the field are getting affected equally, or is one slowing down more than the other?
Yeah, I think it's fairly typical. Banks are, very conservative, and they want to make sure that they are going to get returns. And so, in an unsure environment, in an uncertain economy, they're going to look more towards the strength of a facility that they can point to the previous performance. They say, well, if it's done this well over the past 5, 10, 15 years, depending on how old the facility is, and can even point back to the last recession to see if they have access to those financials, they're more apt to make a decision and say yes going forward on a project like that, versus if you were to walk in and say, I have this vacant piece of dirt, it's 5 acres, and I'm going to put a self-storage facility on it, and I'm going to put an income stream on it, and it's going to be successful, and I'm going to lease it up to this amount, and it'll be at 85% occupancy in 37 months. There, that is a little tougher for banks to bite off on these days, because the economy is uncertain as we head into a recession. Nobody knows exactly. Every recession is a little bit different, and nobody knows exactly how and when, how deep it's going to be, how long it's going to last, and what are the effects, and some of the other fallout from that. So the answer is yes, and yes. Yes, it's more difficult for the banks to bite off on that to get our primary mortgage, and then also our equity partners, our the folks that come alongside of us that invest with us in a passive fashion. They are, during a recession, they're even more conservative and skittish to sit on the sidelines in cash to say, well, let's see how this shakes out, rather than hear a message or watch a webinar from one of our capital raises on a project to say, yeah, I think I'm going to jump on board that roller coaster, and even though the economy is on the way down, I think I'll ride it all the way down with Scott and see if it goes back up again and makes the project. If he hits his projections and makes his returns that he says. So it's just a little more difficult, even though if they did, they would, because we've been at this for a while. We know what we're doing, and we did very well in the last 2 recessions through this. So, but it is more difficult, and the bigger players are seeing the same thing, and
Yeah,
that it's a little more difficult to get the funding from their lending partners as well as their equity partners, and the folks that were starting, very large funds, $100 million funds, $200 million funds. They're backing it down to $50 million or $100 million, and just because they know that there's money sitting on the sidelines that is just waiting to see exactly when we do hit the bottom.
absolutely. And I think what you said about like acquisitions versus development, and how you can kind of like speak to the history of the facility and have some type of proof of concept
Hmm.
is very, very valuable for people listening to this podcast right now.
Hmm.
Made perfect
Hmm.
sense to me. One thing I'm curious about, because you've spoken about past recessions and how that has kind of
Hmm.
instilled lenders' confidence because you have been able to handle your situations despite economic hard times. Do you
Hmm.
think that the sentiment around self storage is stronger because of what we've seen during COVID-19 and how the demand was just skyrocketed, all time highs for rates? It was obviously an asset class that was in high demand and very necessary for a lot of people during this time in our country.
Yeah, so we've got a very good question, James. So we've got now this history of coming out of 2008 to show exactly through that how well self storage did. We've got the data to show that. Whereas if you were in self storage back then, you were having to point back to the last recession and throughout history to really convince a lender, if you will, to say, hey, this thing does very well during a recession. But now the data is so much stronger. So we've got that history behind us. But then we do have the benefit of COVID, which is a mini recession. I mean, exactly. Here's what happens in an economy during a recession, and COVID accelerated that. And for that short period, businesses shut down, individuals stopped buying and moving around for a little while, and all that did was create a demand for storage. And so we've got that window of time again that shows here's what happens during a recession, just like what happened when the economy shut down due to COVID shutting the country down and the world down for that matter. Yeah, businesses went under overnight. Unfortunately, that's what happened back in 2008 when Lehman Brothers fell. Businesses went under overnight. The lending dropped off a cliff. We saw the exact same thing here during COVID in 2020. We saw an awful lot of individuals that lost their jobs as well when other companies quit. And there's folks that just their budget was dramatically affected. One income earner, or sometimes two, had lost jobs for a while and couldn't find replacement income. So they moved back in with their parents. They moved back in with friends. And so their extra stuff went to storage. Those businesses, their extra inventory, and even furnishings in their offices that they had to either sell or give up a lease on, that all went back into storage until the economy and things turned back around again. We had the added benefit of, with the shutdown, when people went home to work, those that were still employed, and then they had to remove some furniture to make room for workspace within the home. And then the kids came home from school. And so now we had to set up school in the living room, and we had to set up an office environment in the dining room. And yeah, so everything went into storage, and it just created a huge demand for storage. And so that was kind of like a double whammy in terms of what a recession looks like for storage. So absolutely, James, it has made it easier for us to be able to tell that story as we head into this next cycle.
Yeah, I think it opened a lot of people's minds to how strong of an asset class and how
Mm-hmm.
people say self-storage is a needs and events-based industry, and it really is true because you don't ever think about it till you need it. And
Correct.
then
Mm-hmm.
you getting the first unit available that's convenient and makes sense to do so.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one thing that we've been having discussions about with people is, do you think any of the metrics for self-storage demand have been redefined because of COVID-19? You talk about people moving back home, downsizing, and making sure that their home space is utilized for home office, or like you said, like
Mm-hmm.
your kids. Um, Houses with basements had originally been looked at as a detractor from self-storage because people would opt to store their stuff in their basement.
Yeah.
But I've been having conversations with some developers who are saying, hey, like people now are using it as a home office, home gym,
Mm-hmm.
or space for hanging out, because you are home so much more in this remote kind of work situation. Have you been seeing anything like that, or is that just too early to tell?
I think a lot of it is still too early to tell in terms of dialing in the actual metrics. But what you're saying in practice is 100% true, and we're seeing that. So we're seeing a couple of different dynamics in place. First of all, since the pandemic, when people were sent home to work, then all of a sudden the employers, even though slowly over the years, the co-working spaces and being able to work at home had been adopted by many employers, and some companies had decided to go totally remote. Well, during COVID, everybody was forced to go remote, period. And so the hanger-oners, those companies that thought, well, we're never going to allow people to work from home because they won't be productive and they'll screw around and we can't keep an eye on them, when they recognize that, hey, when people have a great work balanced lifestyle and that they can be home, they're actually more productive. And truth be told, sometimes if they're dedicated and they really enjoy their work, they'll sneak down and they'll do more work and to get ahead for the next day. The kids go to bed and they'll stay up till 8, 9, 10 o'clock and they'll continue to work, and we actually get more productivity out of them. And then we recognize that, okay, now if a company is going to go completely remote, or at least for certain positions, people don't have to live in Flint, Michigan. No offense to people in Flint, Michigan. I'm from Flint, Michigan. It's my hometown. I don't have to live in Flint, Michigan if my employer is there. I can go live wherever I want. And they can set up shop, because their office is their living room or the basement, as you mentioned, James. So it has made a more transient, it has made it just more transient in general in this country. And so, like you said, we are needs based. And, when the economy is doing well, interest rates are low, people are moving. And when they move, they need to use storage to stage their house, to get all their stuff out, to make it look bigger when they're selling it. And then they put their stuff in storage when they're moving. And then they put it back in storage again when they move to the new location, until they get all settled, only to realize that their house still doesn't have enough room for everything. And so they rent another storage unit. So we are in the trauma and transition business. And so what COVID has done is created a lot of transition. We become a much more transient economy and people as a result of what COVID has done for us. And so those are the metrics, and I think those are the stats that I think over the years we'll begin to understand the full effects of people being able to just move whenever and wherever they want because they're not tied to a company that is located within one city.
No, I think that's so true, and we've been seeing it for sure on our end in
Mm-hmm.
terms of occupancy rates staying high, even despite COVID-19, not being as severe as it used to be, but
Mm-hmm.
there still is a ton of demand.
Yep.
Uh, when you talk about acquisitions earlier and talking about these mom and pop facilities that aren't so tech savvy, aren't as sophisticated, I'm curious like as to what you look for in facilities that are more established, have a PMS system in place. Like what metrics do they track, like occupancy or rates, that are golden signs to you that they can still have a lot of value and it's a good project. Is there
Mm-hmm.
anything, like from your insights that you could provide?
Sure. Our underwriting is based upon the metrics that we receive from Radius, and that is, how do we compare that with the rest of the market? So, we gather that data from the market, and mostly by way of Radius, and then we take a look to see where this facility shakes out. Is the expense
Mm.
ratio a little bit higher, and where and why? If it's in payroll, then we begin to ask some questions of the seller or of the broker. And in many instances, we'll find out, well, they're just over payrolled. They could be that they put a brother-in-law or sister-in-law on the payroll because he or she was out of work, and they decided to give them $50,000 to run a 40,000 square foot facility just because that's what they needed, or they've always done it this way and they haven't utilized a website or a kiosk, or just even now going away from kiosks to just running a website that allows people to rent online and from having mobile capabilities. But they've always just kept somebody in the office. Just a number of ways that technology can reduce the payroll, that really being one of them. So taking a look at then the rest of the market, that is usually the telltale sign, James, is that some of the folks, they just haven't kept up with the market. They're proud of the fact that, hey, we haven't raised rates in 8 years and we're 100% full and we'd rather stay full. And it's like, which is music to my ears, because that's great, because the first thing that we're doing 30 days later is we're going to bring rates up to the market. And so that, when you look at the physical occupancy versus the economic occupancy, if that delta is really large compared to what we would set as a gross potential rental income based upon the competition that we get from Radius Plus, then we say, okay, here's where the horsepower is in this facility. Not only can we add technology to reduce the expenses, but looking at the data that we just received from the market and the reports, here's where we should be in terms of rates. The rest of the market is adding these different ancillary income streams. We're seeing it at these other sites. And so we're going to be adding that as well. Whereas this facility does not have any. They may sell some locks. And if they sell locks, sometimes the owner's just keeping the money and putting it in their pocket.
Mm.
So those are the ways that we are able to create value, at least the two biggest ones off the top of my head.
No, thank you. And that kind of is a great segue into my next question, because ManageSpace is meant to be a tool used by operators or owners to make their lives easier and to keep track of things in a reporting manner, so they can have quick insights and like an easy to read report, and hopefully even make it easier to like eventually sell the facility if that should ever cross their mind. I guess in terms of your experience, what will be something like on a wish list of like reporting or metrics that maybe people don't track currently and that you have to do a lot of legwork to find, that could be done through a PMS system eventually? Or like you said, like payroll, having everything in one spot is helpful for the owners to see where your money's going, where your money's coming in from, but also to eventually streamline the acquisitions process. They can have those kind of reporting on hand.
Yeah, any and all of that, being able to tie in that real time, with historical data that we have in QuickBooks. So, what's our ad spend? I mean, we always have to do, that's a manual process, and we always have to go backwards on. So, having the real time data all in one location just to allow us to make, better and informed decisions on the fly. All of that is helpful for us. So take a regional manager or an area manager. We have meetings separately to discuss, the overall budget and strategy. But if those area managers and then therefore the site managers, if they had more access to more data in terms of the financials and what's happening in the marketplace, that allows them to just make decisions a little bit faster instead of having to wait and be a little more slow moving for additional meetings and gathering that information from a data standpoint. So market data is obviously very, very key for our area managers that are overseeing multiple facilities in one location. But then if we have a tie-in overall to our entire portfolio nationally, and to be able to have real-time access, essentially as real as or as quickly as possible, when I say that, to the financials, and having a tie-in so that they can make those decisions. There's nothing that we hide from our folks. It doesn't do us any good to be able to keep any data close to our chest, because we want to be able to employ every single one of our folks that are out on the street. All the soldiers out there should have the best ammunition and the best tools and resources to be able to make more informed decisions, so that we can empower them to do so. And all of that is done. You make better decisions when you have that data. And outside of that, then they're just flying by the seat of the pants, and they really don't know, and they're maybe too scared to make a decision. But the only way that we know is by having the data, and the only way to tell if you're winning is if you know how to read the scoreboard. And if you don't know how to read the scoreboard, it means you don't have the data to do so. So
Yeah.
it all, I know it's all music to your ears, because that's what you're asking for and that's what you're producing. But just the more the better. If I could just paint a broad brush stroke, it is just having all access in one location by way of dashboards and graphical user interfaces. At least for me, you asked for my wish list. That's how I learn, and that's how I really visually see things, is through charts and graphs rather than just the raw numbers.
No, Scott, I mean, you are correct. Music to my ears. And I love that answer. And I think that hearing it from you, someone as established in the industry, just like kind of validates what we've all been coming from. Like, everyone should know everything. Like, there's no secrets in the industry. Like, it helps everybody to have those kind of numbers, like, more transparent. And I guess like self-storage is a bit behind technologically when you compare it to like hotels or other types of commercial real estate. But I mean, I've seen people's sentiment going towards more open transparency with data. Rates certainly are being shown online more often nowadays, especially in urban markets. But we think that occupancy is still sort of like the holy grail of metrics, and that operators are still going to be a little hesitant to share that data unless everybody gets on the same page.
I believe so, because then you have it for those sites and those facilities where there is a person behind the counter that acts as more of a salesperson sitting in a retail office setting. When somebody comes in the door, they want to be able to, one of the pieces of every successful sales letter or every sales process is creating a sense of urgency and scarcity. So if you can't show scarcity, meaning, well, you got 50 units open, you can't, if there's transparency to the consumer and they see that, then there really isn't much reason for them to be able to move. They can stop, they can shop around a little bit, or they can't negotiate. So I guess maybe from a consumer facing standpoint, maybe that's one of them as that grows. But in terms of the pricing, I mean, that is usually, we've been following the dynamic pricing models of the airlines now, finally coming into the self-storage industry, where the person, if there's a couple, 3 people waiting in line, and one person rents a 10 by 10 for $89, and then the next person in line rents it for $94, and the person, for $94, it was quoted $94, says, "Hey, what gives here?" I said, "Well, it's supply and demand, just like when you buy an airline seat. And, if you want to debate it, the person behind you is going to rent it if you want to step out of line. And then when it comes back to you, it's probably going to be 99 or 103. So, there's a give and take when it comes to that a little bit. So yes, occupancy just drives rates because it is supply and demand. And when occupancy increases and your vacancy decreases, then upward goes the pricing pressure. So they work, in lockstep, or at least they should, if you have a good dynamic pricing model.
Absolutely. And that was a great point about the whole urgency in the sales desk kind of thing. It's a unique perspective on it. We're almost running out of time, but I just did want to ask you, what is like one interesting situation you found yourself in your past experiences in self-storage, or something maybe you wish you learned sooner, or any type of general advice, like last takeaways for our audience?
Yeah. Oh gosh, it's interesting, James. There's a lot of direction I can go with this. I've been in the business for a number of years, and of course, yeah, wish I would have got into it sooner,
Mhm.
and probably created more relationships in terms of partnerships and joint ventures early on. I acted as a solopreneur for many years, and I bought into and heard the horror stories of people that had bad partnerships and lost friendships, and got into partnerships with family members, and it didn't turn out well. And so I really stayed away from that. And you recognize if you want to go farther, you need to do it together, and you can do that faster. And so just creating those joint ventures and partnerships, and recognizing, especially in our industry, James, as you know, and it's hard for anybody who's on the outside doesn't see this, but most of us are friendly competitors. It's rare that you're going to be sitting across the table talking with somebody who's within a 3-mile radius of one of your facilities, that you're not giving up your secrets to. When we go to the trade shows and the industry shows and webinars, we're able to share 95% of our best business practices because it makes everybody better, and it doesn't give anybody else an advantage that's going to eat into your profit margins. It just makes us all better. So that's what I love about the industry. But I think, speaking from that solopreneur position, or anybody who's in a position to be able to make those decisions, I think self-awareness, without getting at a woo-woo level, is probably the best thing that you can do for yourself, gift you can give to yourself as an entrepreneur and as a business owner. We've got a lot of data out there, and you guys are producing a lot of it, and it helps us make better decisions based on those numbers. But there's also a lot of opinions. There's a lot of experts out there these days, a whole lot of folks that are, espousing themselves as experts that are giving really bad advice in our storage space. And I know this because I go on to the forums and I'm in those same places, and I have to correct a lot of these folks because there's just a lot of bad information out there. But I think if you know in your knower what's right for you in your business, having that self-awareness and not allowing yourself to listen to all the negative speak and then all the other directions that other people are taking, only you know what's right for your business. I mean, you got to get educated first, without a doubt. But if you sit back and you don't execute because you're sitting back and pontificating and looking at different theories and ways to do something, and making sure that you get buy-in from everybody, including your team underneath you, your staff, I would say not to. I think you need to go forward and you need to execute your business plan, do it with excellence, do it with the data behind it. But don't get caught up in all the noise coming from your staff, perhaps even your spouse, your friends, certainly not your vendors or anybody else out there on social media. Just move forward with confidence.
Great. That's such an important takeaway, and I agree completely about that. Never know enough. You always learn something new from somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Your point, trust your gut. You're the one who has to live with the decision, so just gotta roll with it. Well, Scott, Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I had a great time talking to you. I learned a lot. I think our audience is definitely going to enjoy this episode. And for those of you who don't know, Scott is also a self-storage, kind of like a guru who runs his own courses, and you can kind of reach out to him to get some more advice as well. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Appreciate it, James. My pleasure.
Absolutely. Thanks, man. Have a good one.